Imagine standing on a quiet street, watching as police officers shove aside an elderly black woman who doesn't fight back, doesn't shout, just stands there with a silence so heavy it makes you shiver. 10 seconds later, the world around. Those cops flips upside down because they had no idea who they had just laid their hands on. If you're hearing this, don't scroll, don't click away, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will shake you, twist your heart, and make you question everything you thought you knew. It was a breezy afternoon in downtown Chicago when the incident began. The kind of day where the sun hit the streets in golden streaks, but tension still buzzed like electricity in the air. And while the crowd moved in and out of storefronts, an older black woman walked slowly, her shoulders stooped yet her movements graceful, like someone who had carried the weight of history itself on her back. And though she was quiet, though she seemed invisible to most, her presence had an aura that demanded respect, though few realized it. 2 police officers, young, loud, and careless, stood at the edge of the sidewalk managing a small protest that had begun to spill over. And when they saw her approach, not shouting, not carrying signs, not even raising a hand, they interpreted her silence as defiance, as if calmness itself was an insult to their authority. And one officer barked, "Move along, ma'am," his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance that comes when a badge is worn like armor instead of duty. But she only stopped, looked past him with eyes that carried stories no one there could read. And in that moment, the second officer, perhaps irritated by her refusal to jump at their command, shoved her back with a force far too rough for a woman her age, and the crowd gasped as her body stumbled, but did not fall, as if the ground itself would not let her collapse. And though she regained her balance, she said nothing, only lifted her chin with a dignity so sharp it cut through the noise. And in those 10 seconds after the shove, a silence fell so heavy that even the protesters seemed unsure of what had just happened, for no one there knew her name. No one there recognized the face that had been seen in history books, in documentaries, in long-forgotten black and white photographs that had shaped the very freedoms those cops thought they were defending. But the woman who stood before them had marched with Martin Luther King Jr., had spoken beside Malcolm X, had been arrested in Selma and beaten in Birmingham, had carried the scars of the civil rights movement and the wisdom of a generation that had changed the nation. And when whispers began to ripple through the crowd, when someone finally gasped out her name as if saying it too loudly would shake the earth, the officers' faces drained of color, because they realized in that instant that they hadn't just shoved an ordinary elder. They had laid their hands on a living legend, someone whose silence was more powerful than their shouting, someone who could dismantle their careers, their reputations, and even the fragile image of law and order they pretended to uphold. And while the seconds ticked by, her silence turned into the loudest condemnation the city had heard in years. Murmurs spread like wildfire, one person whispering to another until the crowd became a tide of gasps and pointing fingers. And the 2 officers who had shoved her suddenly felt the weight of 1,000 eyes burn into them, their arrogance slipping into unease as someone shouted, "Do you even know who that is?" And though neither cop responded, their stiff postures betrayed the growing panic within. For the name that rippled through the crowd was not just any name. It was Evelyn Grace Carter, a civil rights giant, a woman whose speeches had rattled the walls of Washington in the late 60s, whose face had appeared on the cover of magazines, whose testimony before Congress had changed laws. And though decades had passed since her firebrand days, she remained a revered figure in black history, the kind whose silence in the present was more devastating than any loud protest. Yet these officers, too young to grasp the depth of history, had treated her like a nuisance, a shadow to be shoved aside. And now the crowd's anger began to swell, protest signs raised higher, chants merging into a single booming rhythm of shame, shame. While cell phones lifted into the air to capture every second, live streams already pulsing across social media. And though Evelyn herself said nothing, the look in her eyes told a different story, A story of patience honed through decades of fighting a battle she thought had been won, only to see echoes of the same cruelty in the present moment. But within her silence was a storm, because Evelyn had not come to that street by accident. She had been on her way to a press conference where she was to reveal documents exposing corruption in the police department itself. Files she had been given by a whistleblower inside the force, evidence of years of misconduct, cover-ups, and systemic abuse that stretched higher than anyone realized. And as she stood facing the two men who had just shoved her, she realized the universe had scripted a cruel but fitting irony. The very system she was about to expose had revealed itself. In the most blatant way, right there on the street, in front of cameras, before hundreds of witnesses. Meanwhile, the officers, sweating under the gaze of their sergeant who had rushed over after hearing the commotion, tried to downplay the shove as standard procedure, but their words fell flat against the roar of the crowd and the icy composure of Evelyn, who finally, after what seemed like an eternity, spoke, her voice not raised but steady, the kind of tone that cut deeper than anger. And she said, 50 years ago, I was shoved by men who wore uniforms and carried batons. And today I stand here shoved again, but this time I will not walk away quietly. And her words landed like thunder, electrifying the crowd into cheers and chants, as journalists who had already been nearby rushed forward with cameras rolling, microphones outstretched, and within minutes what had started as a minor protest turned into a national spectacle, as news outlets cut into regular programming to broadcast live footage of Evelyn Carter, the legend many thought had retired into quiet life, now standing face to face with officers who embodied everything she had fought against. And as the chants grew louder, the officers were quietly ushered away, but not before one of them, pale and trembling, muttered under his breath, "We're done." And though he meant it as dread for his own career, his words rang true on a larger scale, because those 10 seconds of arrogance had unleashed a tidal wave that was about to drown more than just 2 cops. It was about to sweep through the entire department, the city, and even the nation, as Evelyn prepared to reveal what she had carried in her worn leather bag. Documents that would not only expose corruption, but also show the world that history was not dead, that the fight for justice was not over, and that sometimes silence broken at the right moment could be louder than any gun, any badge, or any shove. As the crowd surged with chants and cameras captured every angle, Evelyn Carter reached into her worn leather bag, her frail hand steady despite the chaos, and pulled out a stack of papers bound with a simple clip, documents that contained names, dates, and signatures of officers, judges, and politicians who had conspired to bury cases of brutality for decades. And when she held them up, the flash of cameras sparkled like lightning, the world suddenly realizing this was not just an elder shoved in the street, but a whistleblowing storm that had been waiting for its moment. The officers who had shoved her were no longer the center of attention. They were now symbols, scapegoats caught in a much larger fire. And as Evelyn's calm but powerful voice announced that she had undeniable proof of corruption reaching the highest levels, the protesters roared, the journalists pushed forward, and the police line faltered, unsure whether to advance or retreat, while the sergeant in charge whispered into his radio frantically, knowing this was spiraling beyond control. Yet Evelyn never flinched. She looked at them with eyes that had seen worse in Selma, worse in Montgomery, worse in Chicago itself decades ago. And she declared, "You tried to silence me then. You tried to silence us all. But today, the silence is broken." And with that single line, she ignited a fire that no force could contain. Because now it wasn't just about a shove, it was about truth, power, and a reckoning that had been building for half a century. The chaos of the street grew into something larger than a protest. Larger than a confrontation, it became a turning point etched in real time. And at the very center stood Evelyn Carter, the quiet black elder who moments ago had been shoved aside like she was invisible, now commanding the attention of a nation. with nothing more than her steady voice and the rustle of papers that carried decades of hidden truth. And as the chants of the crowd shook the air, she lifted her files high, her frail arms trembling only from age but not from fear. And when she spoke, the noise fell away like waves retreating from the shore, because people understood instinctively that history was about to be written in their presence. She began to read, her voice firm, naming officers who had covered up brutality, judges who had dismissed evidence in exchange for favors, politicians who had knowingly bent the law to protect the guilty, and each name struck like thunder, recorded by hundreds of phones live streaming across the globe, spreading faster than any news anchor could summarize. And as the crowd gasped with every revelation, the officers who had shoved her were already gone, but their shame lingered, their actions now immortalized as the spark that had ignited this storm. And while city officials scrambled in offices miles away, while panicked calls flew between police chiefs and politicians, Evelyn remained rooted to the pavement, her silence between each name louder than the chants themselves, because in those pauses people remembered that she had lived this before, that half a century earlier she had been beaten and jailed for demanding dignity. And now, standing unbroken, she was the living reminder that the fight had never ended, that history did not sit in museums but walked among them. And as she declared at last, "They tried to silence me then, they tried again today, but the silence is broken forever," the crowd erupted into a roar so powerful it drowned out every siren, every command, every attempt to contain it. And in that moment, the city realized that justice did not always come from courtrooms or ballots, but from the courage of those who refused to be erased. And though Evelyn's body was frail, her spirit rose taller than the skyscrapers around her, a monument in flesh and blood. And as she turned and walked slowly toward the precinct doors, surrounded now not by hostility but by the protection of a swelling crowd, the world knew that the shove meant to silence her had instead awakened a movement, and that in 10 short seconds of arrogance, the officers had written themselves out of history while elevating her forever as the elder who reminded the nation that truth, once spoken, could never again be shoved aside.